are in Linwood, Washington. Karen, can you spell your name and say your name, please?
Yes, my name's Karen Dorn Steele, Karen Dornsteele.
Okay. I'd like to start with having you tell us, please, about your early life overseas, growing up as the child of a press liaison with the U.S. Information Agency.
And my father had been a reporter in the 1940s and early 50s for the Portland Oregonian. But in 1952, he left the newspaper and wanted to go overseas, so he joined the Foreign Service. So from the time I was 9 years old, until I went to college, I was overseas on various foreign assignments. And it was very interesting. I went to a French school when I was 9, so I learned French. And I also learned, living outside the country so much, to kind of be an observer of other cultures and other places, because it wasn't my home culture. And when I was 9, they used to give us wine mixed with water for lunch in the Belgian school, and my mother complained, and the headmistress said, "Well, milk, madame, is for cats," you know. When my mother asked to have milk served to the children. So there were all these cultural differences that I was able to observe growing up.
And tell us about some of the journalists that you met as a young person.
Oh, yeah, well, our assignment in the late 50s was Morocco. So we went to Morocco and were in the embassy. My father was in the embassy in Rabat from 1956 to 57. And because he was the press attaché there, his job obviously was to get to know the Moroccan press, but also to squire U.S. journalists around. And so I met David Schoenbrunn, who was a correspondent for the television networks, and Pierre Salinger, and a wonderful British woman. She worked for the BBC, named Margaret Pope, who sort of became my unconscious role model because she was very adventuresome. She spoke fluent Arabic, and she would ride into the Atlas Mountains with the Berber tribesmen, you know, and she smoked these long cheroots, you know, these cigars. And my mother thought she was scandalous, but I thought she was wonderful. So it was a very interesting place to live.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about what life was like in Morocco, what you can remember.
Well, it was my first, I was 14 at the time, so I remember quite a bit. It was my first Muslim country, for one thing, where we weren't, you know, the dominant religion. I went to a French lycée of 1,500 girls, Arab girls and French girls. And it was extremely exotic and sometimes a little dangerous. You know, you had to watch out because I was right at 14, being in the Arab culture, sort of a marriageable age. My father used to tease me that if I weren't good, he'd tell me off to somebody, you know. But there was a lot of it was sort of sometimes uncomfortable to be a young teenage girl, and we had to be careful what we wore in public. The beaches were really a scene because the French were used to wearing their little bikinis on the beach, and next to the Arab women who are in essentially full burqas, they called them jalabas, but they were head to toe in black, you know, on the beach. So it was a very diverse place and a very exotic place.
So let's go, are you running?
Yeah.
Let's go ahead in time a little bit. After you graduated from Stanford in 1965, could you please talk a little bit about your time in Washington, D.C., working in Congress for Representative Edith Green of Portland?
Yes, Representative Green was a Democrat, a kind of conservative Democrat from Portland, and she had been a former school teacher, and she did a lot. She was on the House Education Committee, and this was the Great Society era when Congress actually functioned and got major legislation through. Lyndon Johnson was president, and the year before, the Civil Rights Act had passed. But she had found out that there are still major problems with it actually being enforced in the South. And so I was assigned in my first task to interview Mississippi sharecroppers who were flown up for hearings, but they had to be pre-interviewed. And I got just the kind of harassment that they were subject to just for trying to go to the polls was really upsetting to me. It made me angry that as a country we certainly weren't where we should be on the issue of voting rights, and we're still not quite there today, but it was so blatant then that it got my back up.
Now, I understand you moved to Spokane with your first husband, Charlie Dorn, in 1968, after you had finished up your master's degree in history at Cal, Berkeley?
Yes, that's right. My husband had been offered a job at Gonzaga Law School. He had graduated from Harvard Law School. He'd clerked on the Ninth Circuit for a year, and then he wanted to be a law professor. So, and it brought us to Spokane, which at first, I was from San Francisco to Spokane, Washington. I was a little disappointed, but Spokane turned out to be a place where I really could make a break into journalism. It was hard to do in the Bay Area. It was, anyway, I was in a master's degree program, but women were sort of shunted into fashion and food and cooking and things like that. So in Spokane, I was offered a job as an editorial page writer at the Spokesman-Review, which was a daily newspaper in Spokane. At the same time, back in Washington, D.C., many really accomplished women at the news magazines, at Newsweek and the Washington Post, were actually suing their employers because they had been relegated to research rooms where they would do the research on stories and the men would get the bylines. And so to be offered an actual serious journalistic job in Spokane was my first step into journalism.
So now when you began at the Spokesman-Review, you only stayed a year at first and moved into public television with a public affairs TV show that you yourself ran called Spokane Weekly from 1973 to 82, right? And
yeah, that's correct.
Talk about that a little bit?
Yes. I liked the Spokesman-Review, except that its editorial page kind of mirrored its brick tower leaning very far to the right. And so I wasn't comfortable there doing opinion for them because I was much more liberal than the paper's opinion pages. I also reviewed the symphony and did music reviews, which I really did like. But I got a chance to join the public television station, and I leaped at it because I was able. After about a year, for 1 year I had a news show for children, and then after that I was able to become the public affairs director. So for those 9 years I had my own public affairs show, Spokane Weekly, in which we were on live once a week, and we discussed all kinds of news, public affairs about the inland Northwest. We also did documentaries, like when Mount St. Helens blew, we did a documentary on that. Many other things, a lot of Canadian issues too that involved environmental issues, like the fate of the Columbia River coming into our state from Canada. So it was an interesting job. I met lots and lots of people nationally and developed good sources within the region out of that job.
So then what made you return to the Spokesman-Review? Was it, at that time, was the Spokesman-Review two papers, like the Spokesman Daily Chronicle and the Spokesman-Review?
Yes, I was asked to come back as an enterprise reporter in 1982, and there were two papers. I was hired on the staff of the Spokane Daily Chronicle, which was the afternoon paper. So we came to work really early in the morning, and the paper went to press about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But 9 months after I got there, they merged the two papers. There was less and less demand for a daily paper, so they just merged us all into one staff at that time. And I continued then to do enterprise work for them and investigative work. We looked into Kaiser Aluminum's clout in the region, in energy issues, and our local utilities' role in bribing legislators in Olympia to get their way. So lots of really interesting stories.
Now, I hear that you have a Beware Attack Journalist shirt that you got for your 40th birthday. Can you talk about that?
That was just before the two papers were merged. We'd just done a series on Washington Water Power's bribery of state legislators. And the CEO, Washington Water Power, is now called Avista. It's the major utility for the inland Northwest. And the CEO at the time, a man named Wendell Satry, complained about me and a couple of other reporters, saying there's a new atmosphere of attack journalism in Spokane. And so my editor made me a shirt, purple shirt with screaming pink letters that said "Beware Attack Journalists" for my birthday. So I still have that shirt.
That's great. So when did you start working then on environmental issues for the Spokane Chronicle?
For the Chronicle, I started working on environmental issues for the Chronicle just during that 9 months, and the Kaiser stories were about the Bonneville Power Administration and some of the electricity fights about power and whether power should be diverted at cheap rates for aluminum smelters and things like that. So that's where I first got started in environmental reporting.
Okay. So I'd like to switch to Hanford now.
All right.
Okay. Now, when did you start to be interested in Hanford as a topic?
Well, I arrived at the Spokesman-Review in 1983, or the end of 82, and one of the big regional topics that just was emerging at that time was whether Hanford was going to become the nation's prime waste repository for high-level nuclear waste, predominantly fuel rods from commercial reactors around the country. And there were several sites being considered. There was a site in Texas, and there was a site at Yucca Mountain in Nevada, and Hanford. And in order to evaluate whether Hanford was an appropriate place to put all this fuel in basalt deep under the ground right next to the Columbia River, I'd studied geology in college, so I knew that basalt is full of cracks. I tried to find as many sources, both within the Department of Energy, which was pushing this project, and outside people, and I found reports from the U.S. Geological Survey that just panned the idea of Hanford as a site, at the same time that Hanford officials were cheerleading for it. And they had moved, actually the Department of Energy had moved Hanford up to #1 on its list, and the U.S. Geological Survey was saying no way should this site even be considered. And so I did a series of articles on what was called BWIP, the Basalt Waste Isolation Project. And it was the first time that anybody had written stories that challenged their narrative about what should happen. So that was my first set of Hanford stories.
Did you get any flack from these? Did you have, were there people, powerful people criticizing your work at this point?
Not later on. I think there was more surprise that the Spokane paper was even covering this subject, because it hadn't in the past. Spokane had been very conventional. It had very little investigative reporting. It had relied on the Associated Press, basically just AP stories, to put in the paper about Hanford. And so suddenly, you know, the wire services were wondering, well, why is this person in Spokane, and why is the Spokane paper taking up these Hanford subjects?
Got it.
So.
Okay. So now around this time, was it around this time that you filed your first FOIA request?
Yes, it was. After I had done the Basalt Waste Isolation Project stories, you know, my byline was out there as someone at our paper interested in these subjects. And this was the early days of the Reagan administration, and Reagan had announced a major new nuclear weapons buildup and the restart of the Purex plant in 1984. And so one day in 1984, I got a call from a woman who said she was an engineer at Purex, and she said the plant is unsafe, and one day we're going to blow up Pasco. Those were her literal words. Of course, that got my attention, and so I told my editors what I'd heard, and of course I had no idea who she was. She might have been crazy, she might have been legitimate, but I drove there and checked into a motel, and then she came to my motel and showed me her security clearance, and we got started. And what she was telling me is what 40 kilograms of plutonium had been listed as missing from the Purex plant. Nobody knew what missing meant. Stolen, you know, someplace it shouldn't have been, building up in the bend of a pipe that might cause a criticality accident eventually, you know, where the thing would explode. And she told me, she gave me some roadblocks as to where to look in documents. She said, look for reports called MUFs, and I had no idea what that was, and it was materials unaccounted for. And so that was my first Freedom of Information Act request, to look for the reports on the missing plutonium at Hanford. And she was right. I mean, I got the reports. It did trigger an FBI visit to the newsroom, because again, a sense of surprise, well, here's a Spokane paper all of a sudden doing these Hanford stories. And so my editor was asked, what is she doing? Why is she asking about missing plutonium? And my editor, to his credit, said, thank you, when you report the story, when we report the story, you'll know what we found, and ushered the man out the door. The offices of the FBI were right across the street from the newspaper, so he didn't have to come from far. But nonetheless, yeah, that was the first reaction I got, that the national security state had some interest in why we were asking for these documents.
Were your editors becoming increasingly supportive at this point of what you were doing, or were they interested in Hanford at this point?
Well, I think I was sort of pushing them in that direction, but when we got to the human health tolls of Hanford a little bit later, I had some real convincing to do. But we did publish the report on the missing plutonium, backed up by the documents, and a month later, the Department of Energy opened Purex for the first time ever to a press tour. And they were trying to show us that everything was really, had everything under control, basically. And we came, the Oregonian, the Seattle Times, the Spokesman paper, other papers, TV stations, and we brought, I decided that we needed an independent scientist to sort of corroborate what they were saying internally. So we brought in Tom Cochran from the Natural Resources Defense Council in Washington, D.C. He was a prominent physicist, and so he attended the tour also.
Did you recall what his reaction was to the tour, Tom Cochran?
Well, he was skeptical of the perfectly safe, and he asked some very probing questions about, well, if the plutonium isn't stolen, where is it? And how much of a hazard is it? Because, of course, if it is piling up in bins of pipes around the plant, that's probably a worse hazard than having it stolen, or at least theoretically could be. So he asked some very good questions, and it helped give us some contacts that we might not have had without his presence.
Was there any congressional response to this article that you wrote about the missing plutonium?
Yes, there was congressional response, because this was supposed to be the showcase plant for the new nuclear weapons buildup. There were audits made of the plant that were kept confidential, but an auditor eventually went to the Seattle Times with the audits, and so the Seattle Times was able to do a really big story on the safety, or the lack thereof, of Purex.
Did they ever locate the missing plutonium?
They decided it was not stolen, but they didn't tell us anything else about where it was.
Amazing. Yeah. Okay. So now I'm going to focus a little bit on a fairly well-known downwinder that you've known for many years.
Yeah.
His name is Tom Bailey, a farmer in Mesa, Washington. When did you first, and how did you meet Tom Bailey first?
I met Tom Bailey not too long after the Purex story. He was in Spokane for a fundraiser for our Congressman Tom Foley, who later became House Majority Leader and House Speaker. He was, our Nancy Pelosi. And he was having a fundraiser, and Tom was there. Tom had been involved in some issues with the Bonneville Power Administration over where power lines would go, and some of them were crossing his and his neighbor's, or slated to cross his and his neighbor's property, and he wasn't happy about that. So he was lobbying Tom Foley about that and several other issues. And he was a little bit drunk at this fundraiser and kind of loud. But anyway, I went up and introduced myself, and I said I'm newly, covering Hanford and the issues around it, and I knew he lived really close by. And he said, well, the only thing Hanford ever did to us was kill a few sheep. And I'm saying, kill a few sheep, what do you mean? And so that was a story that my editors were really suspicious about. He said, well, here's a loudmouth farmer just talking about, sheep deaths. How do we know that anything, all the stories out of the AP, all the stories out of the Department of Energy, Hanford has always been perfectly safe. So where's the story? And I said, well, I'll look for some documents. And before the larger Freedom of Information Act request came, 6 months later, I did a lot of research on my own, and I found for available documents that show there had been accidents that affected the farm community where he lived, just across from Hanford. And so, based on those documents, I got the go-ahead to go down and visit him in Mesa. And what Tom did was drive me around for a day and a half and introduce me to many of his neighbors. Leon and Juanita Andrzejewski, who were keeping a death map. You know, there were two farmers. They'd been there a long, long time, I think since 1954, if I'm remembering correctly. They had kept a map of all their neighbors who had died of either cancers or heart attacks, and they had this all X's and O's for heart attacks, and they told me that they had been worried, but they had never said anything about their worries except within this tight-knit farming community. And we went to several other neighbors' houses, and there are lots of Mormons in this community, and some of them, well, they tend to be very patriotic, and they didn't really want to talk about government, possible government injury. So we went on to other farmhouses, and we met many, many other people who did want to talk about the fact that they'd always been concerned that there were probably illnesses or accidents that might have affected them at Hanford. And so I met a very interesting Chinese-American man, H.R. Chen. He had a PhD in chemistry. He lived there. He wanted to have some farmland, so he purchased some farmland there. But he worked for the Pasco Water District. And he said, well, when I worked there, they gave me these confidential memos that told me not to drink from the Columbia River or irrigate crops from the Columbia River, but I couldn't tell anybody. He said, because I would have lost my job, and they were all confidential. So he knew, but he couldn't tell his neighbors. So that was a warning sign too. And then we came to Nels Allison's house and a few other farmers who started talking about actual sheep deaths. And I tried to pin down from their farm reports which years they were, and it was in early 1962 that they lost over 100 sheep in that area that were born mummified. They called them the little demons. So after that I started searching for, when I came back to Spokane, I said, well, they're telling some really compelling stories, and not just one person, not just Tom Bailey, but many of them. So we need to try to figure out where to take this next.
Do you know whether the farmers actually sent the dead lambs and the mummified lambs to anywhere to find out why they?
Well, the Allisons hadn't sent any, but one other farm family told us that they had sent 2 mummified lambs to the lab in Pullman, and that they never got any reply. And when the family inquired about why not, someone at Pullman told them that the lambs had been lost or had gone astray somehow on the trip to Pullman. So they never got any answer at all from the people in Pullman.
Why was it that they sent the fetuses and mummified lambs to Pullman?
I think the connection there was a veterinary school there, and they thought that this was so unusual. They'd never seen lambs born without eyes and with these brittle bones, and that couldn't be delivered. They had to reach into the wombs of the ewes and pull them out. It was a terrible thing. It was very traumatic. They'd never seen anything like it, and they wondered if WSU could help them.
Okay. So now there was a veterinarian who was affiliated with WSU in Pullman, correct? Who also worked at Hanford?
Yes, Dr. Leo Bustad had worked at Hanford in the early days, and I just found out about him through more document research, where they were actually doing experiments with radioactive iodine on sheep confidentially at Hanford, but not sharing, of course, any of their information with the farm communities. And I reached out to Dr. Bustad, who by then was a veterinary professor emeritus at Pullman, for an interview. And he was the only person in all of this reporting who refused to talk to me. He just would not sit for an interview.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Do you know when the experiments began at Hanford?
I believe from subsequent documents that they began in the 1950s. I don't know the whole history of the program, except that they were called upon to produce their studies down in Utah during the Nevada test site, the dirty bombs, the Upshot Knothole series of nuclear tests. that rained down, and lots of sheep died, as well as, of course, people being exposed. But the sheep herders sued, and in that lawsuit, in discovery, they asked for studies about sheep deaths that the Atomic Energy Commission had. And the AEC provided one study that wasn't pertinent to the lambs who died at Hanford, but they withheld another study of fetal sheep deaths, which they had specifically been doing research on. And Judge Sherman Christensen in Nevada called that a fraud on the court, and he ordered a new trial as a result of the AEC withholding pertinent documents from the court.
So there was an interconnection between the two sites and the sheep deaths in both sites, possibly.
Possibly, which I didn't understand fully at the time, but as I researched it further, as we got more documents under the Freedom of Information Act, that became quite apparent.
Yeah, okay. So focusing now on the Downwinders' stories themselves, do you recall what the first story was that you wrote about the Downwinders?
Well, the first major story, after I, had done this research, interviewed them all, and tried to get comment from various Department of Energy people, including Dr. Bustad, was in July of 1985. In page 1 shows Tom Bailey standing in his cornfield. You can see the Hanford reactors in the background, and it was titled "Downwinders Living with Fear." And it shows the Andrzejewskis with their death map and working at their kitchen table with a Whoops reactor warning radio on their table, which when Whoops was built, they provided warning radios for people living within a certain radius. But of course, at the time that the Hanford emissions happened, there was no warning. Anyway, it had that. It had photos of other farmers from Tom Bailey's neighborhood, and I did a sidebar called "The Night the Little Demons Were Born," which was specifically on the sheep deaths in that area, and that was the first time that any of those farmers, just neighboring Hanford, had ever gone public with these stories, and it had a pretty big effect. The story. Yeah, here's a picture of Tom Bailey in the field. And then on the back is John Weinberger, one of the farmers, "The Night the Little Demons Were Born," which I think this story for farm families had the most impact of all. These are the Andrzejewskis with their death map, which we reproduced, and then they're just sitting around their table talking about this subject. So yeah.
So after this story came out and got a lot of attention, did Hanford workers begin to contact you as well?
Yes, I did. I got more stories about, primarily, there were very few concerns about the commercial nuclear power plant, Whoops, but there was a lot of concern about the safety of the restarted old plants like Purex. And so a few workers began to speak out, although it was quite risky for them to have their names out in public. So many of them wanted to speak anonymously.
What did you do with these reports that are coming in? What could you do with them?
Well, they added to the narrative. I mean, we'd had this official story from Hanford, from Richland, from the Tri-Cities. It had been a kind of a triumphalist story. We built the bombs, which was true. They helped end the war. They were patriotic. We did our job. We were the greatest generation. But we'd never heard the backstory before, that there might have been people and animals exposed off-site, and that current workers might also be subject to all kinds of hazards working on site. And the next insight into what actually happened didn't come until, in the fall, after the story of the neighbors, Tom Bailey's neighbors. We started to compile a request for a major Freedom of Information Act request on what had happened at Hanford. because none of this was known. I mean, they said, well, we never studied any of these people because we wouldn't expect to see anything. Well, we found out, we wanted to know whether that was accurate or not. We didn't know the scope of the story. So we wanted to know, when we asked about early documents from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, many of them were still classified, and that was just stunning. It was stunning to me even for the Basalt Waste Isolation Project stories, because if you didn't know the backstory of environmental contamination, how could you decide that the site was safe for a brand new major nuclear waste disposal site? So there are two things going on at the same time. So what we felt we needed to do, since many of the documents were still classified and we had to go into court to fight for this too. They didn't just come. But we filed our FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act, which we shortened to FOIA, and so did the Environmental Policy Institute of Washington, D.C., and HEAL, the Hanford Education Action League. And when we were into court, the government argued that, well, we can't release these because it might give away the secret of the bomb. And we said, we're not asking for the details of how you make a bomb. We're asking for the environmental monitoring reports, which showed whether or not there were off-site releases or accidents on-site. So that was the scope, and we asked for, from the beginning of the plants, in the mid-40s, up until the current time. It was a massive request. But by that time, because of what was going on with Purex, and because of the stories on Tom Bailey's neighbors, and because of what the Seattle Times had done with the safety of Purex, there was mounting public pressure to release these documents. And so 6 months later, in February of 1986, they actually released them.
Yeah, can you tell us about the event? Like Michael Lawrence showed up, and what did he say?
Yeah, Michael Lawrence was the site manager at Hanford, and a very young, slim, kind of good-looking, very serious Department of Energy official. And he hadn't really wanted to release the documents, but it wasn't his decision. It was made in headquarters, at Energy Department headquarters. But they had a big press conference. Of course, it was really crowded. And then they had these piles of 15,000 pages of documents, and it was like, here. And so we asked, well, what conclusions have you drawn? And he started out saying, operations have been really, really safe since 1970, and we're proud of what we've done and everything. Of course, the obvious next question was, well, what about the 40s, 50s, and 60s? And he said, I'm not going to answer that question. I'm going to leave it for the public to decide. And someone told me that he had this idea that if he just dumped them on the press would be too lazy to read them. It would be, people wouldn't go through them. I don't know why he would think that, but because, of course, we immediately frantically started to go through them.
Tell us about that experience, going through all these old documents, some of which were probably fairly indecipherable.
Yeah. Well, of course, we immediately started going through them when we were still down there, and then we went off to our prospective newsrooms and things to look further. But I just thought logically it would be good to start at the beginning with the 40s, and of course we didn't know, we didn't know at the time what even the emission figures meant, but there were, but all of a sudden we were going along, and Tim Connor from the Hanford Education Action League, and we were sitting around a big table, and he and I didn't usually work together, but he's an activist, I'm a journalist, but we were there in Richland, and he said, take a look at this. And it was the December 1949 quarterly monitoring report called the Green Run. It wasn't called the Green Run, it was called the Dissolution of Fuel Dispersal. I can't remember the exact title. But when we looked inside, there was this graphic of this huge plume of radioactive iodine that had spread throughout Richland, where the scientists lived. Not usually the dispersion stacks, the 200-foot tall stacks would disperse it away from the nuclear reservation, but the radiation had fallen on the reservation. It had plastered wall to wall. It had spread all the way to Spokane. It was stunning. And so, and I broke that story. I was able to get it first. And again, here's just one more thing about what their prior assurances of their safety just were not holding up. in these documents. And then when we started to analyze them, it showed that the releases were the largest that we'd ever been reported, at least to that point, in the United States. I mean, this is a huge story, not just a few farmers, you know, around Ringgold and Mesa.
So it sounds like the story was growing before your eyes, just like a mushroom cloud.
Absolutely, it was certainly growing, and it kept growing. And it took us 7 years to get more documents on the Green Run. The second batch of documents, which my newspaper had to go into court to fight for, and the second batch showed that the Air Force had run planes, had been flying over this plume and tracking where it went. And the Oregonian did a very good story. They tracked down Carl Gammertsfelder, who was one of the original AEC people involved in this experiment, and he told them that the reason was they were trying to assume what the Soviet Union would be doing in letting out hot or uncooled fuel, because they were in a rush to catch up with us to make nuclear weapons. And I also interviewed him, and he said the same thing to me. But we didn't get the documents on that for the full set of documents for about 7 years. So we just kept getting more and more, and the subsequent documents showed that there was it spread even farther than the first documents had said, that there was a rain out in Walla Walla that day, and so it fell right down on fields that were still, even though it was December, that's kind of a banana belt, so there were cows on grass at that time in certain parts of our region, and so it became a more and more serious story. Did you happen to interview anyone who had lived in Walla Walla during that time, either then or later, any Downwinders who had been exposed during that time? I interviewed June Casey, and several people called me and said I was there at this time. But June Casey had a pretty scary story. I mean, she had just transferred to Whitman College, and she was a sophomore, and she was there during the Green Run. And it was her first semester at Whitman, and when she went home, she was from Oregon, and Umatilla, I believe. When she went home for Christmas, she was just exhausted. She could hardly get out of bed. And then her hair started falling out in huge clumps. She had long, curly brown hair, and it just started, and it never grew back. And she didn't know what it could be. It was like a mystery, a medical mystery. And her parents, of course, were just really seriously concerned for her. But she didn't know about the Green Run until she read a story like in 1988. It was like 2 years after the original reporting, but she lived in Oakland, California, so she saw a follow-up story on the Green Run, and finally she thought, maybe this is what happened to me. You know, it was dramatic. And so I interviewed other people who said the same thing. I was there, and this is what happened. And of course, people in Spokane were shocked that it came to Spokane, especially since a colleague of mine, Becky Nappy, had done a story fairly recently after that about unexplained baby deaths. There was a cemetery, in Spokane that and you know, we couldn't make that. We couldn't prove any connection, but I mean, it was heavy radiation and then a spate of baby deaths. So
when did this increase in baby deaths occur? Was it around 1949?
It was the 50s and 50s when, you know, women would have been pregnant, and 51, 52, where later we found out there were also some pretty large Hanford releases.
Now, during the time you were doing this reporting and more information was coming out, did you get any threats from anywhere for your reporting? Like, were you threatened as a...
I did get, you know, I get angry calls just at work from people who said, I'm a Hanford worker, and, you know, you're not patriotic, you know, you're not on our side. But the ones that disturbed me, though, more than that, were calls to my children. I had, you know, 2 young girls at that time, and so they were on the receiving end, a couple of really ugly calls at home. Do you want your mommy to die? Kind of calls, you know, and I explained to them that it's a cowardly way to lash out at people, and you know, it's just words, you know, but still, it's very upsetting that someone would do that to a child.
Yes, that's what I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
want to focus now on the litigation, otherwise known as Emory Hanford Nuclear Reservation litigation.
Okay.
Or Emory Hanford. Which, okay. Did you in your paper attempt to get the Pigford report unsealed? Can you tell us what the Pigford report was, and then did you attempt to get it unsealed?
We did. Of course, the Downwinders case had been filed, started in 1991. What happened, there was a sequence here because the documents came out in 86. All this reporting was done on what the document showed. And then in 1990, the government, the Energy Department said, James Watkins, who was the Energy Secretary at the time, held a press conference in Washington, D.C., and he said, we know that the Hanford releases were large enough to have put people's health at risk, so we have to go back and find out what happened to these people. So that was the beginning of the major studies, the Hanford environmental dose reconstruction and the Hanford thyroid disease study that looked into what might have happened to the Downwinders. So that was the government's first admission that Hanford emissions might have caused harm. And so just after that, 1990, the first lawsuits were filed. And Thomas Pigford was a prominent nuclear engineer at Berkeley, agreed to by both sides in the litigation, you know, the plaintiffs for the Downwinders and the lawyers for the nuclear contractors. And he wrote a report in Judge McDonald, Judge McDonald's courtroom, for Judge McDonald rather, and for both sides, criticizing the Hanford environmental dose reconstruction dose estimates. He said that the report had not been done correctly and that it was underestimating the doses to Downwinders, and if that happened, it could have, you know, an adverse outcome eventually for the Downwinders. It was an important report, but what Judge McDonald did in 1995, after it had been produced, is seal it. So we couldn't see it. But one of the I can't say who it was, but one of the attorneys in the Hanford litigation leaked me a copy of it, read it to me over the phone. They couldn't actually produce the written document, but they read it to me over the phone. So I was able then to call Thomas Pigford, talk to him about it, and he said he didn't know it was under seal. So he couldn't talk about it in great detail, but he was surprised that it was under seal. And it did eventually, if the Pigford report recommendations were correct, it would have led to the Hanford thyroid dose outcomes, studies outcomes being less than expected, you know, several years later. So it was an interesting moment in the trial with Judge McDonald.
Was there an attempt made by the plaintiff's attorneys to have the Pigford report unsealed?
Yes, they did try to get it unsealed, and we went to court too, the newspaper, to try to get it unsealed, and we were unsuccessful. The Judge McDonald just said that, well, it would be unsealed eventually, and that's how it was left.
Okay. Now, there were two judges in this litigation, Judge McDonald and then Judge Nielsen. Do you have any impressions you'd like to share about either of those judges? How they function?
They were very different people. I mean, they were both Republicans, appointed by Republican judges, Republican presidents, excuse me. Alan McDonald was appointed by Ronald Reagan, and William Fleming Nielsen was appointed by George H.W. Bush. But they couldn't be more different in their personalities. From my observation, and I covered a lot of the Hanford trial, McDonald was pretty hostile to the Downwinders. I mean, he dismissed a huge chunk of the plaintiffs from the case, and was overturned by the Ninth Circuit, and so many of them came back into the case. He was combative. His courtroom demeanor was kind of condescending. Even in his judgment, let me try to find this if I can. Excuse me here for a minute. Oops. Yeah, just, this is October 1998. This is just after he had decided to drop like over 2,000 downwinders from the case. The plaintiff's attorneys had asked for a reassessment of that, and he gave a second order denying their motion to alter or amend his judgment. But he said in this order, this is kind of Judge McDonald sort of synthesized. He said, "This court found the vast majority of plaintiff's scientific evidence is unreliable and or irrelevant to the factual determination which a jury must make. Because of the complexity of this evidence, even the most astute jury, upon hearing it, could reach the erroneous conclusion that Hanford emissions were a cause, in fact, of an individual's disease." You know, I mean, he was telegraphing his opposition to the entire plaintiff's side of the case by those kind of comments, and those were not the only similar comments that he made during the case of the trial by any means.
So why is it that there was a new judge took over the case?
That's a very interesting story. One of the plaintiff's attorneys, Tom Folds, this would be 1998 after McDonald had dismissed, you know, nearly half of the plaintiffs from the case. Tom Folds got interested in the judge's land holdings around Hanford because in some of my stories and other stories, he had been described as a multimillionaire agribusinessman. So he wasn't just a federal judge, he also had vast land holdings. And Folds went to several of the courthouses where the land records are kept around Hanford, and he found out that McDonald and his company had been buying up land. This is the very time when he's dismissing the Downwinders cases. And in order to get that land, McDonald had to certify that the land was free from any form of contamination, including radiation contamination. This is to get a federal loan. And so when Folds found that, he found that to be, he thought it was a profound conflict of interest that this judge is certifying that Hanford land, just north of where Tom Bailey and his neighbors live, is totally free of radiation contamination, while adjudicating this case was a major conflict of interest. So in December of 2002, he filed a motion for recusal with the Ninth Circuit Court, as well as the court here in Spokane. And 3 months later, McDonald stepped down. He said he hadn't done anything wrong, but he could see how it would be used against him in an appeal. And he also attacked Tom Folds, the attorney, for doing this to him, basically. So that brought in a second judge in 2003, William Fremming Nilsson.
There was a study called the Hanford Thyroid Disease Study.
Yes.
And it was ongoing at the same time as litigation, more or less.
Right.
And so, what are your thoughts about that study finding, quote unquote, no health harm from Hanford's I-131? How do you think that happened?
Well, I knew this was done by the Fred Hutchinson Center in Seattle. Very prominent people, scientists working on this study. But strange things happen, and it could be, I don't know that for a fact, but it could be as a result of what Thomas Pigford said about the header doses being underestimated. But the thyroid disease study was using the Hanford header doses, and if they were underestimating the doses, then the result would be a weak or no finding of causation in an epidemiological study. And that's exactly what happened. And the Fred Hutchinson people said they were surprised by the result, that they didn't expect that. They thought they were going to find a more robust association, but they didn't. But one thing they didn't tell the public and were not forthcoming about at all, I didn't think, and this came out later when the National Academy of Sciences reviewed the report, is that their study lacked the statistical power to come to any conclusion. So my feeling was that should have been the message. Our report didn't find, we couldn't answer the question, but instead they came out with a really overhyped statement of that there's no connection between Hanford and an individual's doses. They were careful to say that doesn't mean that any one individual couldn't have gotten a cancer from thyroid, but they went further. They said, well, everyone in the region should be reassured because of our study. That was just hubris. They shouldn't have been reassured by a weak study that was possibly based on biased data. And I think the Downwinders were right to be furious about that, because there was a big pushback to that result. And then they were also grilled in Spokane when the National Academy came and released its results. Then they were really grilled at that time by the NAS panel on the statistical weaknesses of their report.
So how did these results of the Hanford thyroid disease study vary from the other studies that have been done of low-dose exposure to ionizing radiation from Nevada Test Site or Marshall Islands?
They were an outlier. The Hanford study was a total outlier. Chernobyl, the Marshall Islands, and all the other studies, the Nevada Test Site studies, all showed a positive, significant correlation, but this one didn't.
So there has been some review after HTDS by independent scientists of the results, and what was their conclusion on why this study was different?
I don't really remember. I don't really remember that.
I know. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Now, so I want to talk a little bit about the plaintiffs in the litigation. Were you able to meet very many of the Hanford Downwinder plaintiffs, and do you remember any particular stories?
As I kept covering the trial, I would see, well, obviously I would see the participants, but I would also see other Downwinder observers who would come. Not everybody could come, and the trial was in Spokane, and for many people it was a far-flung trip, but many stories stand out. I mean, Deborah Clark was very sad story. She tried as Judge Nielsen had taken over the trial. Her thyroid cancer was getting worse and worse, and she tried to get an expedited trial in Nielsen's court. Her lawyer tried to do it, but she was rebuffed in 2010, and she died the next year. And our photographer, Spokesman-Review photographer, took a picture of her. It's such a stark photo because she has this giant hole in her neck. I mean, they had to take out her entire voice box. And in order to speak, she had to put her hand on her neck, just to compress her neck in order to speak. And she said her grandchildren were afraid of her. And, it was just a tragedy. And she was only 69 years old. And the thyroid cancer had spread to her bones. And so she was also in a lot of pain. And it also, the arguments between the lawyers sort of showed such polar opposites. Her lawyer, Dick Iman of Spokane, asked for like an expedited trial and a verdict of $20 million because of all the pain, suffering, operations, shortened life, everything she'd had. The lawyer for the defendants, Kevin Van Wart, said $10,000 would be about what they'd give, and that it was a stunt to bring her up for an earlier trial. And the judge did side with the defendants, so with the contractor, saying it would be wrong to kind of take her out of order in the case. So, so that was that was pretty tragic. She was born in October 1949. She was born in December 1949, the month of the Green Run. And of course, we know that raised cancer risk for kids throughout the area. And her sister Rebecca, who was born in '51, also developed thyroid cancer and died at age 48. So, that's just one of many very sad stories out of this trial. Shannon Rhodes, who was one of the bellwether plaintiffs, as they're called, the test plaintiffs who were chosen to actually have trials, also had thyroid cancer. She went through 2 trials. She was a bellwether. Her first bellwether trial deadlocked, so it was declared a mistrial. Then her second trial in the same year was the jury found for the defendant, said she had not proved that that Hanford more likely than not caused her cancer, which was the legal standard that was used in this trial, which was interesting to me because in the Nevada Downwinders trial, the one that got a second trial, the judge used the weaker standard of likely cause, that the fallout likely caused people's cancers. So at Hanford, with a stricter standard, more likely than not was a standard, and she, according to the jury, didn't meet that standard. She was born in Spokane in 1941 and grew up in Colfax on a farm. And she said, she was exposed to emissions during World War II, and then right afterwards, the Green Run and in the early years of the Cold War. So that was another very, very sad case.
Were there some of the downwinders that I've spoken with have several issues? They have either two types of cancer or an autoimmune disease and a cancer. Can you comment on that?
Yes, Wanda Buckner was one. She was also a bellwether, and she didn't get to go forward either. I mean, she wasn't, her claim. She didn't get a good result in her claim. But yeah, she had lots of health problems. And when I met her, she was in a wheelchair and did very, very low energy, hard to get around, and from the autoimmune disease, and that she had other nutritional factors that were bothering her. And so there seemed to be a range for a lot of these people, these plaintiffs, a whole range of symptoms from fatigue, depression, and just general diminished quality of life from what they had experienced.
I wanted to ask you, there were two different major litigations of downwinders, one being the Nevada Test Site case and the other one the Hanford case.
Right.
And Judge Bruce Jenkins appears to have looked at all the calculations for dose, whether it was defense calculations or plaintiff's calculations, whereas in the Hanford litigation they looked only at header.
Yes, right.
Comment on the different approaches and which one, could that have disfavored the Hanford Downwinders?
Oh yes, I think Judge Bruce Jenkins did a lot, admirably did a lot of his own work, and unfortunately, really tragically, they never got a chance to have a second trial down there. But he did all the groundwork, laid out all the groundwork to look at the two conflicting sets of doses. And that didn't happen at Hanford. The Hanford Environmental Dose Reconstruction Project, for all of its problems, and there are some other problems I'll mention in just a second about it, that really cast doubt on it, they were pushed by the defense, but they were also stipulated to by the plaintiff's attorneys for use in the bellwether trials, which means these doses that might have underestimated that led to the weak result in the thyroid dose case were agreed to by everybody except one of the attorneys, Tom Foles, who said he didn't agree and he refused to sign the stipulation because Tom Foles had done his own very detailed analysis of what had happened, and he just didn't agree with that case. But there was another reason that came out in discovery, largely through Tom Foles' work about header, which was very important, and that is that header had been promised. This big dose reconstruction project had been promised to the public of the Northwest. That would be the gold standard of science, that it would be completely unbiased, just the best science ever. And it turns out in documents that Tom Foles obtained for the trial, that the Justice Department, Maine Justice, and lawyers for the Department of Energy, as soon as the lawsuits were filed in 1990, started to insist that their own lawyers, their own legal staff, would sit in on the header meetings, at least some of them. We don't know how many, at least some of them, because of their interest in using header as litigation defense. Now that is just the opposite of unbiased gold standard science.
Yes. And who conducted the Hanford Environmental Dose Reconstruction Project for the first 10 or so years. Was it under the control of the Department of Energy? Or?
It was, well, yeah, there was an independent panel, for a while, but most of it was conducted by the Department of Energy, and John Till, who is a nuclear scientist, was in charge. But it was a Department of Energy study, and that's not what the states of Washington and Oregon had originally wanted. They had wanted a study completely divorced from the Energy Department because they knew, at least they knew some of the backstory of what had happened in some of these other stories, other cases, especially down in Nevada.
So, but eventually the study was transferred to the Department of Health and Human Services, correct? To CDC?
Yes, the CDC eventually got involved. Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Right.
Now, this is a broad open question, or wide open question, just to give us your thoughts on the outcome of the Hanford Downwinder litigation and what you feel about it, since you've covered it for so many years and know so many of the plaintiffs and what their lives were like.
Well, I found it to be very sad and kind of an indictment of our judicial system, frankly. This took 25 years. You know, that's a quarter of a century, this litigation, which in itself is exceptionally long. But it meant the people who are already sick were dying along the way. And of course, their estates were still in the case. But it spun out for so long. The dynamic of having all of the legal costs of the Hanford contractors paid for, no questions asked, by the federal government, which was part of an indemnification agreement that went back to the Manhattan Project. It made sense in those days because here DuPont and then GE were asked to come in, DuPont to build the plants, GE to operate them, unknown. They'd never scaled up a nuclear plant to this level for building brand new weapons. These corporations wanted to be indemnified, and they wanted other legal costs as part of that indemnification. So that did make sense, but it got perverted to massive expenditures of money and delays on the defendant side. That in a normal trial, you have two sides, have a finite amount of money, and so there's pressure as you're running out of money and as the months and years go on to settle or do something or resolve the case at a jury or something. Get a trial date and then go to that trial date and then have a resolution. In this case, it just went on and on and on. Every decision that went in favor of the defendants, in favor of the plaintiffs, was appealed up to the Ninth Circuit. The plaintiffs also appealed on occasion, but there was this way too lengthy process, and then it ended on a very irresolute note for most of the Downwinders, who never had their chances really to tell their story at trial. And also in a peculiar way, although it was probably the right decision, Judge Nielsen had ruled early on when he took over the trial that Hanford was an ultra-hazardous activity. So that meant that the plaintiffs didn't have to prove that Hanford was a hazardous place. But in a way, it took the narrative away. It all became a case about strange mathematical formulas about dose and response instead of the story of how people's lives had been affected, what they hadn't been told, all this done in secrecy to them, and then their suffering from that point on. It doesn't mean that every claim was valid, but on the other hand, it meant that what we're supposed to get to at the end, at least I always thought, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a reporter, but what I always thought in trials should be the outcome is some measure of justice. And at the end, we had secret settlements and no government apology. And to me, that was not a good outcome.
So secret settlements, although the money for the settlements came out of public funds.
That's correct. That's correct. I think that was wrong. The settlement should not have been confidential.
Okay. So now, do you feel that a solution such as a no-cause it's like a no-fault sort of compensation program like it has been created for Nevada Test Site Downwinders, the radiation exposure compensation, might be applicable to a situation like Hanford in the future? Or do you feel that going through the litigation again if there's another group like us? Would be-
Well, I thought actually that the Hanford Downwinders should have been treated the way the Hanford nuclear workers were treated, where eventually, ultimately, for many, many years, Congress fought any compensation schemes for either workers or downwinders in Nevada or Hanford or anywhere else. But eventually, a compensation scheme of, I think it was in most cases, $150,000 per worker if you had been working in certain places, got certain doses at certain times. And admittedly, it might have been a little easier because you were monitoring workers to establish, a good dose level. But on the other hand, if they had just done that, if they had just taken the strongest downwinder claims and say, here's your compensation range for that estimated dose, that would have gone a long ways. We would have avoided these years of trial and suffering for people, and we would have avoided perhaps most of the $80 million that we spent on lawyers for the contractors. And even if that money had been divided up in a compensation scheme, it would have led to more justice than the way this thing came out.
In fact, the list of recognized radiogenic disease for workers perhaps could have been applied to
Exactly.
downwinders.
Yes.
And the Hanford exposed workers have a special exposure cohort, so they don't have to show their dose.
Right.
If they're have one of the diseases that are listed.
Right.
Perhaps that would be a
Right.
fair approach.
Yeah.
Well, that is. Last question I had here was your thoughts on what we as a country can learn from the Hanford Downwinder experience. A broad, open question.
Well, we're talking again about a renewed arms race, at least under our current president. I'm not sure that's going to happen, but if we ever do have another nuclear arms race, we should have checks and balances. We have checks and balances in every other area of our government, and we should have one in the nuclear enterprise. We should, have inspections and information being public, not having this terrible arrogance of at least of the old Atomic Energy Commission. Somehow stories to me really resonate, and one of the stories from Stuart Udall's The Myths of August illustrate this perfectly, where one of the high-level atomic energy commissioners had a pregnant daughter-in-law and a son who was working as a park ranger in Utah. He knew that the big, dirty, upshot knothole tests were coming. He paid for his pregnant pregnant daughter-in-law and her husband to get on a plane and leave Utah while the tests were going on, while every other family, was exposed. I mean, that's outrageous, and we have to avoid that if we ever do this again.